Hello cruel world, my name is Dr. Sohom. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist. I assess mentally disordered offenders for a living so that you do not have to. Today's video is going to be a bit different. It's going to be extracts or clips from when I was on Shaun Attwood's channel a couple of weeks ago. If you haven't seen me on that, the video is going to be about incels, so specifically about the Plymouth incel recent tragic massacre. And also a little bit about talking about the psychology behind the incel movement. And if you did see me on Shaun Attwood's thing, then I'm afraid this is going to be like when you used to turn on an episode of Friends and they would have like an episode that's just made of clips and flashbacks of other previous episodes and you feel a bit cheated. And I am cheating you to a degree, but such is life. What are you going to do? Sue me. Sit back, enjoy, and welcome to Psych for Sore Minds.
Dr. Das, who happened to be in Guildford today, has kindly come to my house in the studio room, and we are doing a live stream on the recent spree killer in Plymouth and his relationship, how he was inspired by the other incel spree killers. We've got Elliot Rodger and Alec Manessian out of Canada. Dr. Das is just going to go over the basics of what happened in Plymouth first before we look at the mindset of the shooter and the incel community. So for people who are not familiar with the violence that's just recently occurred, are you okay to give a little bit brief description of that?
Yeah, I think I know the very basics. Okay. So this man, Jake Davidson, who obviously identified with the whole incel movement, and I think that drove his actions. Was it a week ago, Shaun?
Yeah, last week. Yeah,
last week he went postal, for want of a better word, and he went on quite a tragic killing spree, really. So he killed 5 people. His first victim was his mother, who he had had a problem with, been having arguments with, I believe because he believed that she owed him some money. And then he went on a random killing spree. He killed 5 people altogether, horrifically and tragically, including a 3-year-old girl.
So we've been asked in the live chat, specifically now by someone who's just come on, what is the definition of an incel? And I will read that to you from the dictionary. It is a member of an online community of young men who consider themselves unable to attract women sexually, typically associated with the views that are hostile towards women and men who are sexually active. Quote, self-identified incels have used the internet to find anonymous support. So they have their own language, whereby women are called femoids as opposed to females. Femoid. A Chad is a alpha male with a Rambo-like jawline. The incels, the men who can't get sexual relations with women are believed, some of them because they don't have the correct jawline and the skull shape. But there are other variations of incels, such as height cells, who believe they're not tall enough to attract women. Addict cells are people who are drug cells. I can't remember what it was specifically. People who've got addiction issues.
Ment cells.
Ment cells.
So that's people who've got mental health issues such as autism. Yeah. I have to say, from I until recently I didn't know that much about incels. I'd heard the phrase and I knew very basically what they were, but having done a bit of research, it goes much deeper than I was expecting. So it's not just the belief system and the entitlement towards finding a sexual partner, and it's not just the language. They actually have theories, like quite deep, detailed, obviously well thought out theories. So one of them is the black pill theory, which I think is actually relevant to Jake Davidson. I believe he expressed on one of his videos that he believes in this theory. So that's the theory that people are genetically programmed to be attractive or unattractive. So if you're unlucky enough to have got the black pill, then it's all genetics and it's all chance, and therefore you're doomed by society to live in.
So that's an extension of the Matrix, the blue and the red pill. That's where they've got that from.
Yeah.
And I'm going to play now a clip so you can actually hear the killer's own words. Just bear with me 2 seconds.
No, I can't. I'm so beaten down and defeated by life. That drive that I once had, that's gone now. You know, I try, and I always keep trying. But it's like, I'm at the point now where it's like, why do I even bother? Like, for what? You know? I'm still in the same house, same situation, same position, same, everything's still the same. For the most part, it's just been me against the world. It's just been me fighting an uphill battle with a big rock on my back, you know, while I'm seeing that don't deserve half of anything. Now they're getting a free ride to the top. The whole premise of the Terminator movies is that, you know, everything's rigged against you. There's no hope for humanity. You know, we're on the brink of extinction. You know, these machines are unstoppable, killing machines that can't be beaten, can't be outsmarted. But yet, humanity still tries to fight to the end. And I know it's a movie, but you know, I like to think sometimes, you know, I'm a Terminator or something. And despite you know, reaching almost total system failure, he keeps trying to accomplish his mission. You know.
All right, so you heard him talk about the Terminator there, and many people who have come across this case on the news have never even heard of the incel community. So an incel is an involuntary celibate. That is somebody who has not had sex, a virgin, male, with a misogynistic belief system that has been cultivated online to the point now where they estimate there are hundreds of thousands of incels worldwide, and there are tens of thousands of them in the UK. This is just what kind of brainwashing and manipulation is that?
So I don't think it's a new phenomenon. I think there's always been a small proportion of sexually frustrated males that have had misogynistic views. What I think is different, what I think has changed, and what I think is driving the incel movement is they now have a platform, they now have a forum. Because you can't just go out and share these beliefs with anybody, because you're likely to get your head kicked in. But if you find areas on the dark corners of the internet, then you can have other people that support your beliefs. And if they give you permission to act in a certain way, speak in a certain way, use derogatory terms towards women, then it builds this support and this movement. So yeah, it's a very potentially extremely dangerous situation, I think.
So they're like trying to recruit people through like gaming platforms, you know, young lads like 10, 11, 12 years old. I mean, what could be done to stop this movement from expanding to the point where, you know, the frequency of these spree killings increases?
I mean, decreases.
Decreases, sorry.
Well, I think there's a couple of approaches. So you can think about the individualistic approach. So I think parents have a responsibility to look at the content that their children are watching. And I think it's very easy for children to get groomed when they feel that they're belonging to part of a community, whether that's originally through gaming and now it's the older men who are trying to brainwash them. So I think that's one issue. And the other issue is for the police or other companies to supervise and observe what the content that's being put out there. And I think it's only fair that big platforms like Facebook, for example, have a responsibility in curtailing hateful, misogynistic views.
We did play earlier on the 1.5 minutes of the Plymouth shooter talking, and Manny Chudundi has asked, what do you think of his state of mind on that YouTube video?
I think it's really interesting. I think actually we saw a really clear window into his psyche in just that short period of time. So the first thing that strikes me as a psychiatrist is the negative cognitions which indicate depression. So he's saying things like, why do I bother? You know, I put in all this effort, I have the same house and the same position, it's me against the world. He's obviously preoccupied with being ugly. Also, at some point he talks about a lack of drive and motivation. So to me, this is barn door clearly depression. So depression is more than just low mood, it's also a lack of energy and all these negative cognitions. The other thing that kind of excited me a little bit as a psychiatrist was the fact that he was talking about the Terminator. Now, I don't think this is psychosis, because he said clearly that he feels like the Terminator, and he also said, I know it's just a movie. But in another set of circumstances, it's very possible, and some of the patients that I assess who've committed horrific violence have psychotic beliefs. So they might, for example, think that they are the Terminator. But I think in this particular case, it's a red herring. So I think all of these things in combination can at least explain some of Davidson's actions.
Do you think he killed more because there was no way back?
I think the short answer is yes. I think he had such a level of frustration and hatred that he just didn't care anymore. I think he was willing to end his life. I think he hated his mother and he just wanted to get rid of her. And I think once he made that decision, there was no turning back. It didn't really make a difference to him who he killed. I think that's reflected by the very randomness that he would pick on an innocent child, because somebody in their right mind wouldn't make that decision. So yes, I think that's correct.
How do the spree killers compare, the incel spree killers compare to other killers you have psychoanalyzed?
So I should say the vast majority of the people that I analysed haven't committed murder, and even the ones that do, only a very small proportion go on to kill other people. Because I'm a psychiatrist, I tend to treat people who've got mental illness. So the vast majority of them have something like schizophrenia or some form of psychosis. So they're not in control of their thoughts and their actions. They suffer from hearing voices or paranoid delusions. Yeah, so it's a big difference.
So what formed these guys then? Like, have you looked at whether they suffered any abuse or had any previous criminal history?
Of the patients that I see?
No, the three incel killers, yeah.
So I don't know very much about Elliot Rodgers' background, I'm afraid, but I do know about Alec Manassian and, to a degree, Jake Davidson's. So I think that something that can't be overlooked is the fact that Alec Manassian clearly had autism, and Jake Davidson was at least suspected of having autism. Now, just to be very clear, I'm in no way suggesting that autism directly leads to violence, and the vast majority of people that have autism, of course, are not dangerous. However, if you're already kind of isolated, marginalised, and you feel inferior and you feel different, then that feeds into the kind of incel way of thinking, specifically about not being able to get attractive women. And then if you have autism on top of that, when you struggle to understand social norms and you struggle to get social reciprocity, then I think it can make some people, very small proportion, but some people feel even more marginalised, even more isolated. So I think they're all risk factors that come together in this perfect storm, especially for those two, Jake Davidson and Alec Manassian.
How did this guy even get a gun?
So my understanding is that when people get a gun licence in the UK, the people in charge look at three particular areas, and they are whether this person's a danger to the public, whether this person has a mental illness, and the social media posts and beliefs of this person. So I think Jake Davidson ticks all three boxes. So I'm at a loss to explain how this could have slipped through the net. So I really don't know the answer to that. I think if they were doing their job correctly, then on all three counts, he shouldn't have been given access to a weapon.
Do you believe, Dr. Das, that the Columbine killers were incels?
As far as I'm aware, they had a general feeling of hatred and resentment towards other children because they themselves felt isolated and marginalised. But as far as I'm aware, they didn't feel sexually deprived. So I don't think that's quite the same as incel. I think some of the thought processes and the hatred clearly was there, but I don't think they specifically identified with the incel movement. But tell me if I'm wrong. I haven't done research into these things.
I think they predated the incel movement, didn't they? So we've got a question here from Socrates. Elliot Rodger was assessed and had pervasive development disorder, which I've never heard of. Could Dr. Das please expand upon that, Shaun?
So pervasive development disorder is like a blanket term for all kinds of developmental illnesses. So autism absolutely falls in that category. So does Asperger's, and so do some rarer kind of syndromes that you probably wouldn't have heard of because they're not as common and they're not as publicised. But absolutely, it's that same kind of illness as autism is. Yeah.
So what's the symptoms of that?
So generally speaking, people with autism, they have, as I mentioned before, problems with social reciprocity. So they can't read other people's moods or their intentions. And on top of that, they struggle to communicate. So they don't have the body language, eye contact, And as well as that, they tend to have quite restricted and narrow ranges of interests. So in this particular case, we know that Jake Davidson was obsessed with guns as a kid. So it's possible, and I can't really say definitively unless I got the opportunity to assess him, but it's very possible that he wasn't just interested in guns like some young men are, but that he was obsessed with it, and that could have been related to his autism.
Do you think that an incel that did not commit suicide could be rehabilitated?
I think my view is skewed because of what I do for a living. So my business is rehabilitating mentally disordered offenders. So my answer would be yes, I think it's possible. That's not to say that it can happen in every case. I think if, not just an incel, but anybody that has committed horrific violence, if they have insight and motivation to change, it's possible. So some people are just born in horrific environments, and they come from places of abuse, and they witness violence, or in the case of an incel, they might be brainwashed from quite a young age, and they might have a very warped way of thinking. And then after they've committed atrocities, whether in prison, whether in psychiatric hospital, some people, not all, will reflect on that, and they will realise the error of their ways. They will engage in rehabilitation, whether that's about domestic violence, anger management, and sometimes there's other factors. So other factors would be things like drug and alcohol use, mental illness. So I'm not saying that being an incel is a mental illness, that's just a way of thinking, but there might be, for example, depression, anxiety on top of that. So if all of these things get treated, and if somebody engages to and wants to change, then absolutely, I think it's possible. I think it's possible for anybody to potentially be rehabilitated.
What physically happens when you go psychotic? Wow.
So people experience psychosis in different ways. The main two symptoms are delusions and hallucinations. So delusions are fixed, unshakable beliefs that come from an ununderstandable source. So for example, if you had a very right-wing extreme view, or if you had a religious fanatical view, that's not a delusion because that's in keeping with an understandable source. So in people that I see in the mentally disordered offender population, delusions tend to be paranoid. So people are watching me, people are trying to hurt me, people are trying to kill me, people are poisoning my food, the neighbours are watching me, helicopters are following me, the FBI's following me. So these are very presentations that I see. The next most common symptoms are hallucinations. So you get visual hallucinations or auditory hallucinations. Contrary to popular belief, actually visual hallucinations are quite rare in psychosis. They tend to happen to people who are extremely unwell. It's far more common for people to have auditory hallucinations, which is basically hearing voices. And the voices can be insulting, they can be derogatory, but the most dangerous type of auditory hallucinations, and the one that I see very commonly, are command hallucinations. So that's when a voice is telling you you have to hurt yourself, and you have to go with a hammer, and you have to go out and hurt them. So that's in a nutshell what psychosis is.
Like you see these cases where you have to go and take your kids out to the desert and kill them. The voice is telling you to do it, or God is telling you to do it. I saw so many headlines like that when I was in America.
Yeah. I think I talked about this when I was last on the podcast, Shaun, but the case that just really jumps out to me for so many reasons was Andrea Yates. So in 2001, she became completely psychotic. She killed her 5 children. It's just a horrific, really sad, tragic case, but just in terms of the symptomatology, it's just barn door psychosis, and just what happened with the whole medical legal trial was also fascinating. So I did a video on it on my channel.
Yeah, and we interviewed Shane Taylor. It's called Knife Maniac's Redemption. And I think that Shane has agreed to come on with Dr. Das. We're going to probe deeper into his mind. And Shane, when he stabbed some people, he went into such a psychosis that he didn't know what he was doing as he was walking away with just a knife handle. So I'm wondering then, just adding on to that previous question, when someone starts to hear these voices and have these hallucinations, is there an average time period whereby it goes from the mental to the physical, to the person acting out on that?
I don't think it's a time period as such. Well, firstly, I would answer that by saying there's different types of psychosis. So the most common one that I see would be schizophrenia. So that's a long-term chronic psychosis. It's usually lifelong. There are other types of really quick psychosis, like drug-induced psychosis or postpartum psychosis when women have just had children. But if we're not talking about those, if we're talking about the more common ones like schizophrenia, it's not necessarily a length of time that has to pass. It's different people will have a different threshold of acting upon it. So my analogy is this: if you were walking down the street and somebody you didn't know, a complete stranger, just turned around and insulted you, like called you a twat or something, you don't know this
Called
person.
me a bald cell.
Then there'd be a certain proportion of people, I think everyone would be offended, right? But there'd be a certain proportion of people that would do something about it. They might shout back, they might sort of hit back. Most people would probably do nothing. But the proportion that would actually take it to the level of physical violence is pretty small. So I think that's the same in psychosis. So the vast majority of people that hear voices don't act in violence, but there's a small proportion who are just willing to take that step. Because in their head, what they experience is real. It's not their fault, but they believe these voices or they believe these delusions. And if you genuinely thought people were watching you or trying to hurt you, then some people in that situation would act violently.
Kevin Madigan, I'm wondering how this question would be answered differently in America than the UK. It's a legal question. I know you're not a lawyer, Dr. Das, but I'll put it to you anyway. Could you kill a person who's blatantly on a killing spree in the UK?
I think you could. I think you'd have a legal defence. I think it would all depend on the evidence, right? So you'd have to be able to prove with witnesses, for example, that you were doing it to end a killing spree. I'm pretty sure you'd get a defence. But if you got manslaughter, for example, so the difference between murder and manslaughter in terms of sentencing is that all murder in the UK is a mandatory life sentence. The judge has no discretion. Whereas manslaughter, which would be this case, it's at the judge's discretion. So it could be anything from completely dropping a case and releasing that person to one extreme. So that would be a situation, battered wife syndrome, where you get somebody who's killed their partner after years of domestic abuse might be another situation. So everything from that end of the spectrum to a life sentence.
The next question is from Music Spiral Universe. Are you born with mental health disorders or conditions, or are they brought on by trauma? So it's the old nature versus nurture debate.
I'm happy to answer that. It's a complex question because it depends on so many factors. So something like autism, for example, or a learning disability, so this is what we were talking about before, pervasive developmental disorders. Developmental means exactly that, so it's part of your earlier development, so you are born with those disorders. They might not come out, or they might not become obvious until later on in life, typically the age of, say, 4 or 5. But they're permanent. Other types of illnesses such as neuroses, anxieties, depression, they run in families. So if you have a relative, especially a first-degree relative, and to a lesser extent, second, third-degree relative, that has these genes, then that predisposes you to having those kind of illnesses. And that's very similar with psychosis. So people who have illnesses like schizophrenia in the family are predisposed to suffering it from later life. And then trauma is kind of a beast on its own. So trauma can accelerate or trigger some disorders like anxiety and depression, or trauma themselves can cause their own mental disorders. So post-traumatic stress disorder, which I'm sure most of you would have heard of, would be a prime example of that. So that's something that wouldn't have occurred had it not been from an extremely traumatic incident. So that's just a very brief summary, but it's extremely complicated. There's so many different presentations and so many different risk factors. But very broadly speaking, it tends to be nature and nurture combined.
Brilliant. Rebecca Nicol, what do antipsychotics actually do to the brain? What are they treating that causes psychosis?
So antipsychotics block dopamine receptors. I'd be the first to admit as a psychiatrist that the science behind it is murky and there's so much we don't know, but we are learning through studies regularly. So we know that the dopamine hyperactivity in certain parts of the brain, like the hypothalamus, is connected with schizophrenia, and we know that blocking some dopamine receptors, though not others, has this antipsychotic effect. But they're very blunt tools, and I said this before, most antipsychotics have side effects, and some of them are quite nasty, so I fully understand why some people wouldn't want to take them.
Dr. Das, do you think the International Manual of Diseases stance on personality disorder is superior to the US's DSM? I should wrote that last time then. I hear you all simply have the diagnoses of personality disorder with features.
So it's quite complicated, and I suppose it depends how you use either diagnostic manual. So the DSM, especially the DSM-5, talks more about traits rather than individual diagnoses. So I think it's arguable that's more of an effective way to do it, because otherwise you're kind of labeling things that are normal human emotions. Whereas if you're talking about dimensions, then you're recognizing that you're only diagnosing something if it is impacting that person. So I think the newer American system is better. I just as a quick sort of side note, I've done a couple of videos on personality disorders in the past, including on my channel, and I have received quite a lot of backlash and a bit of vitriol, and I think that's because the diagnosis of personality disorder is contentious, and I agree with that. I've never said that's not the case. I'm purely telling you scientifically what the definition is. I think there's a very just argument that over-diagnosing them or labelling somebody with a personality disorder is damaging.
Brilliant. Got a guy here who's been very honest with what he's saying here. He's saying he could be on the verge at some point of doing something. Hello, Shaun and Dr. Das. I have paranoid schizophrenia and have very bad command hallucinations and worry that one day I will act on the command because it's very dangerous. Could you tell me how not to act?
Yeah, that is, I have to say, extremely worrying. That's not a healthy situation at all, Michael Darby. I think that you need to address that. So I think the first thing you need to do is speak to your family, speak to your general practitioner. If you're struggling to get an appointment, or you're struggling to actually get any engagement, which I'm very sad and ashamed to say is often the case nowadays, then you need to go to A&E, accident and emergency. I think it's quite dangerous to assume that you can just minimise them or ignore them. I can see someone else has just asked what is a command hallucination, so just to help put that question into context, a command hallucination is usually in the form of hearing a voice telling you to do something. So classically it can be to hurt yourself or to hurt other people. Only a very small proportion of people with schizophrenia have this symptom, but it's a presentation that I personally see very commonly because it leads to violence and offending, so it leads to people ending up in my services.
PTA, how responsible is CAMHS for identifying potential incels?
So that's CAMS, that's the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service. I think that CAMS, generally speaking, isn't responsible, and the reason for that is because it's about addressing, well, first of all, they're under-resourced and understaffed, so they tend to see children who are presenting with very overt mental illness, such as depression, suicidality, psychosis. Being an incel is obviously not healthy, but it's not technically a mental illness. It's a warped system, value system, a warped way of thinking. So I don't think the onus is on CAMS to try and sort this out. I think the onus is on parents and schools to try and root out this hateful behaviour and address it.
Why are command hallucinations never about helping people? Why are they always telling you to do bad, violent things? That's interesting.
Yeah, that is an interesting question. And in my career, I have, on very rare occasions, seen voices, not necessarily command hallucinations, but voices in general, or even delusions that can be quite pleasant. But it is a small minority. The vast majority of people have unpleasant experiences. And I can only assume that the reason for that is because people who are mentally ill have psychological turmoil somewhere. It's either because they've had abuse or trauma in their upbringing, or because they know that they're having experiences that other people aren't having, and they have a degree of insight. So I think it's more people in that situation are going to be psychologically distressed than are going to be in a happy, stable, balanced place. But it is theoretically possible. It's rare, but it's possible for somebody to have happy hallucinations.
In the beginning, we did ask the viewers if you would like to see Dr. Das come to the studio and do at least 2 hours on the incel spree killers. Do you want to just say a little bit about your channel?
Sure. So it's been going on for a bit less than a year. It's called A Psych for Sore Minds. And basically it's my expertise as a consultant forensic psychiatrist. So sometimes I talk about high profile cases, true crime cases, and I give my own spin. Like I did a video on Alec Manassian, who we were talking about before, did a video on Andrea Yates. Sometimes I talk about my own cases of patients that I've seen, which I think is my USP. I think there's nowhere else on YouTube you can get that. Obviously I anonymise my patients out of respect for patient confidentiality and the victims involved. But I give my own psychoanalysis. Sometimes I talk about individual diagnoses, sometimes I interview people who've got experience of mental health issues, like people who've been sectioned in the past, for example. So there's something for everybody on my channel. I post 2 videos a week on a Tuesday and Friday. Go check it out, please. So that was it. That was a selection of clips of me on Shaun Attwood's channel. Big shout out to Shaun. Thank you for having me on. If you're not subscribed to this channel, you have to do it immediately, because not only does it help me out immeasurably, but it actually makes clothes come out of your washing machine far less creased than they usually do. That's all I have to say. Remember, stay euthymic, and whatever happens, do not forget, I love you.